Now, the water underground has a very interesting mode of behavior. It actually has a surface. We call it the water table. Because it turns out the top layer of the ground is not always saturated. We call it the aerated zone, meaning it has air within it. Now, sometimes there's water in it when it rains, and that rain percolates down through the aerated zone. But at the bottom of that is a zone of rock that's entirely saturated, meaning all the pore spaces are filled with water. And the top of that saturated zone is what we call the water table. Now, it's interesting, the water table roughly parallels the topography at the surface of the land. Where you have high elevation, the water table is increased. Where you have valleys, the water table drops. However, unlike surface topography, the water table goes up and down, largely as a result of how much precipitation is percolating down into it. So if you have a period of extensive rains, you'll actually raise up that water table. This has very interesting implications for wells, because you may have a well getting your water that's working quite nicely, and then you go into a period of drought and that well may suddenly run dry because the water table has just dropped below the bottom of your well. It doesn't necessarily mean you're done forever. If there's a wet period, you may see water come back out again when that water table rises up. Sometimes you can actually see the water table at the surface. Very often streams represent the intersection of the water table and the surface topography, where you get a valley dropping down and water constantly at the bottom. That often controls the location of the water table. Interestingly, with wells, the location of the water table is also tremendously dependent upon local geology. I actually have a cousin in Vermont who built a house once there, and he had to drill down about 20 feet to reach the water table. Well, a house was put in across the street from him, and they had to drill down about 150 feet to reach water. There's no way to know by hydraulic pressure. Did you ever wonder why there are such things as a desert oasis? Like, do you ever watch a movie and the people ride camels across this sea of sand, and all of a sudden there are palm trees in the middle of the desert? How did he get there? Where does that come from? Well, that's often the case of an artesian well, where you have water that flows into a layer of rock at high elevation. And as that rock dips down across a desert, the water gets pushed down across. If you have something that breaks that layer, such as a fault, the water will actually be forced out by hydraulic pressure. The pressure of the water backed up throughout the layer. For the Sahara Desert, mountains like the Atlas Mountains cause this hydraulic pressure to develop a large distance across the desert. And that water can come up in the middle of the desert, water that came in the mountains, in the Atlas Mountains. Now, underground pore spaces are filled with water, and the top of that saturated zone is what we call the water table. Now, it's interesting, the water table roughly parallels the topography at the surface of the land. Where you have high elevation, the water table is increased. Where you have valleys, the water table drops. However, unlike surface topography, the water table goes up and down, largely as a result of how much precipitation is percolating down into it. So if you have a period of extensive rains, you'll actually raise up that water table. This has very interesting